Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
I've always had a hobby most people find a little disturbing and scary. I'm obsessed with folklore. Not the fairy tale, Disney clean kind. I mean the stuff people whisper about when it's late and nobody wants to sound crazy. Especially folklore tied to sound, noises in the woods, voices where there shouldn't be voices, patterns people swear they heard but can't prove. It's not that I believe any of it is real. That's the thing people always get wrong. I don't go looking for monsters. I go looking for the moment where something unexplained happens, and instead of saying, "I don't know," people build entire mythologies around it. That's what fascinates me, that exact point where confusion turns into story. The truth behind the stories, that's what I chase. So when my friend Peter told me his uncle had a lake house out in the Appalachians and asked if I wanted to tag along for a few days, I didn't hesitate. He framed it like a break, a mini vacation. Fresh air, no signal, just chill. But for me, it was something else entirely. The Appalachians are probably one of my favorite places in the world. It's where the legends are everywhere, the monsters are even bigger, and the number of people who disappear every year or come back with surreal, impossible stories is a lot. I couldn't contain my excitement and said yes immediately, without even thinking twice. After that, I spent days and days locked in my basement, trying to figure out which story I was going to investigate this time. And when I found it, I couldn't have been happier. People around there have a phrase they don't like to explain. The hills have eyes. No one says it jokingly, and that's the detail that hooked me. The drive out there ended up taking longer than I had originally expected. Not because we got lost or anything as simple as that. The GPS technically worked the entire time. But because the roads gradually began to be more challenging, as if we were being guided away from places rather than toward them, with gas stations becoming fewer and farther between, houses turning into trailers and then into nothing at all, until all that remained were endless stretches of dense forest pressing in on both sides of the road so tightly that it almost felt like the sky itself was being swallowed. It's a magical place indeed. Peter didn't seem to notice any of it, or if he did, he didn't care enough to comment, since he spent most of the drive blasting music and talking about completely normal things like fishing, beer, and girls. The kind of grounded, everyday conversation that almost felt out of place against the backdrop of where we were going. While I found myself increasingly distracted, watching the tree line more than the road ahead. At one point, more out of curiosity than anything else, I reached over and turned the music down a bit and asked him, in a half-joking tone that didn't fully hide my interest, whether he had ever heard anything strange out in these parts. To which he immediately laughed and asked me to define what I meant by strange. When I clarified that I was talking about voices or sounds in the woods that didn't quite make sense, he gave me a look that suggested he was already regretting bringing me along, before telling me that his uncle's neighbors were the kind of people who would happily fill my head with all sorts of old stories if I asked them, which, whether he realized it or not, was exactly what I had been hoping for. When we finally arrived, the lake house turned out to be even better than I had imagined, sitting slightly elevated above the ground and overlooking a stretch of water so still and dark that, by the time we got there, it almost looked black, with no other houses visible nearby and no artificial light sources to break up the darkness. Just trees surrounding the property on all sides in a way that made it feel less like a clearing and more like a temporary interruption in the forest. It was genuinely stunning. Peter slipped into vacation mode almost immediately, giving me a quick tour, handing me a beer, and settling into the kind of relaxed mindset people come out here for. I tried to follow his lead, I really did, sitting on the porch and listening to the insects while watching the faint movement of the lake's surface. But even then, I could only think about everything I'd read at home and all the places nearby that I wanted to see. He must have noticed the look on my face, because he laughed and said I was always the same old me. That night, I was talking to Peter, explaining that there were a few places I wanted to check out the next day, asking if he wanted to come with me or if he preferred to stay by the lake and just relax, since that was the whole point of being there anyway. And at first he said he'd come, seemed interested even. But later that evening, things shifted a bit. We were sitting in the living room when his uncle arrived. He had been working in a nearby village and decided to come spend the evening with us instead of staying at his place there, which he usually did during the week. The conversation started casually enough, just small talk, until it turned toward the area, the forest, the kind of things people say about it. He mentioned that there were stories, a lot of them actually, about strange sounds at night. Things people hear deep in the trees that don't quite match anything familiar, and depending on who you ask, those sounds mean different things. Some people say it's just wildlife. Others believe the forest carries unnatural sounds. But there are also those who insist it's something else entirely, something that communicates in ways we don't fully understand. He talked about people who believe the forest is full of spirits, that at night they move, that they interact, that what you hear isn't random. And then he mentioned something more specific, a kind of local story about a woman dressed in black who is sometimes seen moving between the trees, not approaching, not speaking, just present. I'd already heard and read about that legend countless times, but honestly, it always struck me as one of the more far-fetched ones. Everyone had a different version, and there was no real consensus. People were probably seeing something similar and unsettling, but everything else felt like it had been made up to fit the story. At least, that's what I thought. Then his uncle said something that really caught my attention. He mentioned an old transmission station, abandoned for years, sitting deeper in the forest, about an hour's walk from the house, completely isolated, surrounded by nothing but trees and uneven ground. The kind of place you wouldn't stumble upon by accident. He said that when he was younger, not long after it had been deactivated, he had gone there once, maybe twice, and that he had heard sounds inside, strange ones, the kind that at the time he assumed came from people living there. Because it's not uncommon for abandoned structures in remote areas to be used by people who choose to live off the grid, away from everything else. Still, he admitted that it had unsettled him enough that he never went back. I had spent time looking into the area before coming, reading what I could, checking maps, trying to find anything worth exploring. And I had never come across any mention of that station, not even a vague reference, which made it feel less like a known location and more like something overlooked, something that existed just outside of what people usually pay attention to. So, after his uncle left us for the night, I told Peter that I wanted to go there the next day, that I was genuinely curious. He hesitated, said he might come, but that he'd decide in the morning, which I understood, because not everyone is comfortable with places like that, especially when they're isolated and abandoned. I told him there was no pressure, that he could stay by the lake if he preferred, enjoy the day, and I'd go on my own, because at that point, I was more interested than cautious. Looking back, I think I underestimated that. The next morning, I woke up excited in a way that now feels a bit naive, like I was focused entirely on the idea of exploring something unknown without really considering what that might involve. And I set out early, following the path as best as I could. The walk itself is quiet, almost peaceful, the kind of calm that makes you forget how far you are from everything else. It wasn't until I was maybe a mile away that I saw it, rising above the trees. The structure itself, tall, with a tower that stood out against the sky in a way that made it immediately clear how exposed and isolated it was. Even from that distance, there was something about it that didn't feel inviting. Still, I kept going. When I got closer, I saw that the area was fenced off, though parts of the fence had been cut or bent, enough to suggest that others had been there before, which reassured me slightly, because it meant I wasn't the only one curious enough to come this far. But the moment I touched the metal, I heard something behind me. It came from the direction of the trees, not loud, but distinct enough that I turned immediately, because I hadn't seen anyone on the way there, and the idea that something, or someone, was nearby without me noticing was enough to make me pause. At first I thought it might be an animal, which in itself was a concern, given where I was. But there was something about the sound that didn't quite match that, something closer to movement you'd associate with a person. I stood there for a moment, trying to decide whether I was overreacting. And even though nothing else followed, the feeling stayed. That awareness that I wasn't as alone as I had assumed. Even so, I climbed through the opening in the fence and went in. And that's where things stopped making sense in a way that I can't fully explain even now, because almost as soon as I stepped into those structures, into what used to be rooms, corridors, sections of the station, I lost my sense of direction completely. At first it didn't seem serious, just a matter of unfamiliar layout, different levels, uneven ground. But the more I moved, the less certain I became about where I had come from, where the exits were, how everything connected, and what started as curiosity slowly turned into something closer to concern. There were windows, but not always where I needed them, sometimes too high to be useful, other times blocked or positioned in a way that didn't help orient me. And I found myself moving from one space to another, trying to piece together a mental map that never quite formed. For a while, I told myself it was manageable, that I just needed to slow down, retrace my steps. But as time passed, I became more aware of the risks, the instability of the structures, the possibility of weak floors, collapsing sections, the kind of hazards that make abandoned places genuinely dangerous if you're not careful. And then there was the light that gradually, and without me noticing at first, started to fade. I could tell from the upper levels, from the way the brightness shifted, from the shadows stretching differently across the walls. And with that came a growing urgency, because being inside that place during daylight was one thing, but being there after dark with no clear way out was something else entirely. I moved faster, then slower again, trying not to make mistakes, trying to stay aware of where I stepped, but at the same time feeling that pressure building, that sense that I needed to find a way out before it was too late. But as I went deeper, from corridor to corridor, from one section to another, I realized that I no longer had any clear idea of which direction led outside. And that's when it started to feel less like exploring and more like being really stuck. At that point, I could feel the shift in myself very clearly, because up until then, I had still been trying to approach the situation as something I could manage, something I could solve by staying calm and thinking it through. But gradually, that gave way to something else entirely, something much closer to desperation, because the more I moved through those corridors and those rooms without finding a way out, the more aware I became that night was approaching, and I had no reliable way of leaving that place before it got completely dark. So my focus changed from trying to get out immediately to trying to find somewhere I could stay without putting myself in even more danger. Somewhere enclosed, stable enough. Somewhere that would at least give me a sense of protection against whatever might move through that structure during the night. Eventually, I came across a space that seemed more suitable than the others. A small room with 4 walls and a low ceiling, almost tucked away within the rest of the structure. And the way it was positioned made it feel, at least in that moment, like I could remain there without being easily seen, as if it offered a kind of concealment that the more open areas did not. It also seemed to be on a slightly higher level compared to where I had been before, and I remember thinking that if anything entered from the lower parts of the building, whether animals or otherwise, it would take longer to reach me there, which at the time felt like a small but important advantage. Even though in reality, I had no way of knowing how true that was. The truth is, I had never been in a situation like that before. Completely alone, deep in a forest, inside an abandoned structure, with no clear sense of direction, and no guarantee of being able to leave when I wanted to. And even before it got fully dark, I was already frightened in a way I hadn't expected. A kind of fear that settles and becomes difficult to ignore. But what I didn't realize then was that it would get significantly worse once the light was gone. At first, it was subtle, something I almost dismissed as my imagination adjusting to the silence. But from somewhere in the distance, beyond the walls, beyond the immediate space I was in, I began to hear what sounded like voices. Faint and irregular. The kind of sound that you instinctively try to interpret as human because that's the closest reference you have. And yet, from the very first moment I heard them, I knew, with a kind of certainty that didn't require reasoning, that they were not people. Because there was something about the way the sound carried, the way it seemed to move through the space, that didn't align with anything I had ever heard before. It wasn't just that I couldn't understand what was being said, it was that the sound itself didn't behave like speech. It felt closer to whispering, but without the structure of words, like fragments of something that almost resembled language, but never fully formed into it. As time passed, that sound didn't remain distant. It grew closer in a way that made it feel as though the space itself was closing in, as though whatever was producing that sound was moving through the structure without following the same paths I had been using. And I could feel my body reacting before I had time to process it. My heart racing, my breathing becoming shallow, that instinctive awareness that something was approaching even if I couldn't see it. And then it became too much. There wasn't a specific moment where I made a conscious decision. It was more like my body acted on its own. And I stood up and started running, without any real sense of direction, without knowing if I was moving toward an exit or deeper into the structure. At that point, the only thing that mattered was putting distance between myself and whatever I felt was getting closer. I was completely disoriented. Every corridor looked similar to the last. Every turn felt uncertain. And I knew, even as I was running, that I might be making things worse, that I might be getting myself more lost. But stopping didn't feel like an option. And that's when I heard a voice, clearer than the others, distinct in a way that immediately set it apart. And what unsettled me most about it wasn't just that it sounded human, but that it sounded familiar. So much so that I had the almost immediate impression that I was hearing my own voice, calling out from somewhere ahead, telling me to come that way. I can't explain how that would even be possible, and even now it doesn't make sense when I try to think about it logically. But in that moment, it didn't feel like something I needed to question. It felt like something I needed to follow. Through the dim light, through the shifting shadows, I thought I could see the outline of a figure ahead, indistinct. And everything happened very quickly after that, so quickly that I can't clearly separate one moment from the next. I followed that voice, not because I had a reason to trust it, but because something about it felt like the only direction that led out. And within what must have been less than 10 minutes, though it felt longer at the time, I found myself outside, standing in the forest, the air different, the space open again. And almost immediately, my sense of direction returned. as if something that had been interfering with it simply stopped the moment I crossed that threshold. I didn't stop to question it. I kept running through the forest toward the lake house, retracing the path as best as I could, moving as fast as I was able, until I saw the house by the lake in the distance, lights on. When I got closer, I realized they were already outside. Peter and his uncle, both of them clearly on edge, already prepared to come looking for me. By the time I reached them, the relief I felt was almost overwhelming, and I could see the same in them, that shared recognition that something had gone wrong, even before I said anything. When I finally explained what had happened, or at least tried to, because even then I couldn't fully articulate it, I noticed something in his uncle's expression that I didn't expect. Not disbelief and not confusion, but something closer to recognition, like he understood more than he was saying. Peter, on the other hand, was uncertain, somewhere between skeptical and unsettled, which I don't blame him for, because I know how it sounds. But he also knows me well enough to know that I don't invent things like that. That if anything, I tend to look for explanations rather than jump to conclusions. Still, I could tell they both saw how shaken I was. Not just from the fear of getting lost in that structure, which was real enough on its own, but from everything that came with it. The loss of orientation, the sounds, the voice, the fact that none of it behaved in a way I could understand or rationalize. After that, we stayed there for the rest of the trip, but I wasn't the same for the remaining days, not really present in the way I had been before. More like I was going through the motions, aware of everything, but unable to fully engage with it. Even being by the lake, which should have been relaxing, even with them trying to keep things light, I couldn't shake that feeling, that sense that something had happened that I hadn't fully grasped. I've tried to think about it since then, to find some explanation. And there are theories, things people talk about, like magnetic fields affecting perception, altering your sense of direction or time, especially in mountainous areas. But even if that explains part of it, it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain the voice. It doesn't explain the way the space seemed to distort. It doesn't explain why I couldn't find my way out of something that, on paper, shouldn't have been impossible to navigate. I never went back, and I won't. Whatever that place is, whatever exists within it or around it, it was enough for me to understand that some things aren't meant to be explored alone. And if anyone ever decides to go there, knowing what I've just told you, then at the very least, don't make the mistake I did. Don't go by yourself. Don't assume you'll be able to find your way out just because you found your way in. And if something tells you to leave, don't wait to understand why.